things because even if you have 50 colors in your oil pastel set, there will be instances where you're overlapping and layering, and you will be needing to mix these colors. So this is a brief introduction about color theory. Color theory is a whole entire class that takes the duration of an entire semester. We will not go into it that in depth. We're basically going over just sort of fundamentals of it so we know how to use our oil pastels. Color is in the light. I feel like by now, you should have been introduced to this idea. As you can see in this image here, the light getting sort of refracted through this prism, you can see this sort of narrow spectrum of visible light that our human eyes can interpret. So these images on the side here where the plant and the yellow flower and the little light blue cups, the colors aren't actually in the objects. What we see as color is what is the band of narrow light that is reflected off of the object that our eyes can pick up. So if our human eyes were somehow suddenly able to see more of the light spectrum, because the visible light spectrum that we can interpret is very narrow, if we were able to pick up more, suddenly things I imagine, would look very, very different. Anyway, moving on. This is, again, should be by now some sort of common knowledge that you guys have already been introduced to. I show you this slide because when I talk about primary colors, it is pertaining to pigments, and I talk about red, blue, and yellow being primary colors. There are other systems of primary colors where it's cyan, magenta, yellow, and then that uses cyan, magenta, yellow, or that uses red, green, and blue. These pertain to printed media. So if you have like an inkjet printer, you'll notice your inks are the CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and usually a black, because you would be wasting all of your color ink just to create blacks. But the theory is you add all of these and you get a black. Similar but different in RGBs this is usually digital work. So if you work in Photoshop at all, your colors are, the settings are RGB, where this is red, green, and blue light, and they combine it together and you get a white. White is not really a color. White is the entire spectrum of light together that hasn't been broken up, and we see it as white, but we need to give it a name, so we call it white. But that's essentially, it's the zero value, right, where there is no value taken away. So primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, is what I will be talking about. You mix primary colors to get your secondary colors, right? You mix red plus yellow equals orange, yellow plus blue equals green, red plus blue equals purple. Tertiary colors are the colors that you take your primary colors and you mix with the secondary colors. So sort of lime green minty color, if you added more yellow to the green, you would get this, or more green to the, more yellow to the green secondary, you get that. If you added more blue to your green, you get this sort of aqua turquoise color, as with the rest. So I need you to know what primary colors are. I need you to know what secondary colors are. I need you to know what tertiary colors are. Moving on from tertiary colors. What you notice here is this suddenly starts to look like a wheel of colors, and we literally call that the color wheel. In the color wheel, like the primary color, if you see colors organized in this sort of triangle, we call those triadic colors. And they are enough of a contrast that they become sort of nice sets of colors. When we start to look at what type of colors that we're going to use, what type of colors we need, or like how color is organized in your composition, we start talking about whether it's like a triadic color or analogous color. Analogous means it's right next to each other on the color wheel, or complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors that are immediately opposite each other on the color wheel. And these complementary is also really important to know because this is how we get chromatic grays. And I'll talk about what chromatic grays are in a second. But in addition to just plain complementary colors, there is something called a split complementary color. Again, this is when we are trying to figure out how to organize our colors or like what to match what with. You need to know what your complementary is versus what the split complementary is. A split complementary is the colors right next to the complementary of the tone. So if you're trying to find a split complementary of an orange, the orange complementary is this sort of, this is a red orange, so the complementary of the red orange would be this teal. And its split complementary, which would be the colors that are analogous to its complementary color, is the green or that light bluish color, or actually that's the primary blue. So I hope this makes sense. If you're trying to find the split complementary of the yellow, the complementary of the yellow is purple because it's immediately opposite each other. The split complementary is the magenta or the indigo. So I do need you to know these terms. And moving on to color temperature. Colors have a temperature, as in like these, we call these half of the circle of the color wheel warm colors and the other half cool colors. But it usually, so this translates to light temperature. I've talked about this briefly, I think, when we were photographing, when I was asking you to photograph work to try to avoid really warm light or really cool light, because you can see this wall is the exact same white the entire way, but depending on the bulb that has the warmth or coolness of the range of warm or coolness of the bulb, you get a range of different whites, and it's literally just the amount of the spectrum that is shown in that bulb. Anyway, this is important because it affects the colors that are within this warm light versus cool light. If you see here, this is an example of the color of this couch. If we blocked everything out and only looked at the back of this couch, that gray versus this gray, if we were to swatch them and put them next to each other, would be entirely different colors, right? Because this is like almost a brownish gray, and this is more of a bluish, achromatic gray. But keep that in mind. Those are important because let me show you an example of an artist. Wayne Thiebaud is like one of my favorite artists. He is an amazing painter. But you notice all of his shadows are very cool, but he does this on purpose because of the subject of his painting are these cakes. The whole thing, the cake itself is constructed of all warm colors, right? This sort of orangey beige with the cherries. And to contrast that, to make that stand out more, you give it a complementary shadow. The light on the table also looks like it would be a very warm light, and it casts this cool shadow, and it makes these objects pop a little bit more. When you put things of analogous color together, things blend in, it becomes a little bit more blurry and not as prominent. So if you want things to stand out, contrasting colors are important. If you want things to blend together, you use analogous colors. Here's another where he's used all the different types of colors in his shadows. What I want you to pay attention to is even in creating this one really warm, really cool shadow, you see there's edges that are green and red. He's using that triadic color set to create this sort of dark grayish edge. What I want you to start noticing is sort of the value range of these colors, not only in here, but in these stripes of the cupcake paper itself. I want you to pay attention to where that blue line is versus that red line is. And if I made this whole thing gray, I want you to keep your eyes on right there. you see the value change of the red and the blue. Like the blue and the red here, the red, I mean, it looks like a darker color, but it's still a brighter color. We touched on this before. The red is such a brighter color, you don't notice that there's a difference in value. But once you notice, it's really hard to not see where the blue is definitely a lighter value. So if we like toggled back and forth from the black and white to the color, you see the difference in value of the color. And again, value is light and darkness of a color. It has nothing to do with like the color itself or the saturation of it. What I mean by that is there is literally 3 parts to a color that we need to know. This is another thing that I know it's a lot of information so far, but this is really important that I need you to know. We've talked about how the most saturated version of a color has a different landing number of value of where it lands. So when I say hue or when I say color, I usually mean hue, and the hue is the name of the color. So this, you say hue because it's all of this, a part of that spectrum of light, but for us to be able to talk about it and identify it, we give it names like blue or aqua or green or lime green or yellow or orange. And so these are common names, and that's what we call, the common names are what the hues are. Each hue has a chroma or level of saturation. The more desaturated it is, the closer to a gray it becomes. The higher the saturation, the more pure color it becomes. And each saturated color has a level of light or dark. And again, this is sort of the chart that we looked at last time, where the most saturated, they call it red, purple, or the magenta, lands on like a 6 or a 5 rather, while the most saturated green, yellow lands on a level 3 value. So keep those in mind, especially when we start using color and we have to like define things that are further apart, or we need to define that shadow. Not only are you looking at what color is matched to the painting that you are working from, but you want to think about what's contrasting and what's not. Because anyway, so when we mix color, the hue itself are like I said, the most saturated part or pure saturated version of the color of the hue. We call those pure colors. To tint a color, we add white in painting because we have a white pigment, but it's sort of diluting it in that way. You can also just add less of the pigment and just more of the medium. I'll show you an example of what I mean in a second when I do the drawing demo. But there are also methods of changing your color by toning them or shading them. Shading and toning is kind of the same thing. Toning, here it's a little misleading. It says adding gray or black. We don't actually add a gray or black. We make a gray or black by adding its contrasting colors or its complementary colors. So here's an example of what I mean. To create, like, let's go from this green. If we want to to tone this green, you take a little bit of its complementary color, which is this magenta, and you add it to the green and you get this muted sort of foresty green. And from there, you want to mute it a little further or shade it further to give it a darker value. You add more of its complementary colors and you get to a darker value of that hue, right? And you do this until you see at the very end here, it's almost sort of a gray. And you look at this inner ring, and all of these colors in the inner ring are browns and grays, and these are what you call your chromatic gray colors. And all of these colors are achieved by combining your complementary colors to create these sort of neutral colors. So this is probably the most important thing I need you to know of what are your primaries. And from your primaries, mixing your primaries gets your secondaries. Mixing your secondaries with your primaries gets your tertiaries. And from your tertiaries and secondaries, primaries, all of these colors at the outside ring to shade them to get these more muted, interesting, more natural colors that we see in our environment. You add the complementary and you create these colors that way. Yes, I asked you to buy a 50 pack oil pastel, but even then, not all of it will be available, and you will still need to figure out what colors to mix and to match them more accurately. Any questions about this? Like last time, like when was it? Weeks? I think it was week 7 where we did the tonal value with the water soluble crayon. How I asked everyone to go into Art Store and figure out which drawing or which master's copy that they're working from. It's the same for this week's assignment. You can choose to grid or not. That's up to you, but I'm not going to repeat how to do this because all of that can be found in week 7. So I have here prepared the image of Gauguin's life landscape, and I've loosely gridded and loosely outlined where they need to be. Before I move on to that, let me go ahead and show you what I mean by mixing and blending before I jump into that. There, like, here's a primary red, here's a yellow, and here are your primary colors. I think this was an optional tool, the mover. You don't need it. You can literally just mix by crayon only. That's totally fine. If you have one of these, you can try because it just helps to create a smoother texture. This is like I'm not using the knife, but I'll show you how to like scratch away and create lighter values. But anything that's like has a blunt sort of metal tip, I have a palette knife that will also work. If anything that's sort of like this, I haven't tried toothpicks. I imagine they would work. And a couple of Q-tips. I discourage you to use a Q-tip, but I want to also show you what I mean by why I ask you not to use them. So here's a red. When you do put down oil pastel, please make sure that you cover all of the paper texture. If you don't put enough pressure, you will sort of get this light paper texture through it. What happens there, it just ends up looking like crayon, and it doesn't really make the drawing well. But what you can do is control the pressure when you're mixing colors. Like now, I just added yellow to that small amount of red there, and it created this sort of red-orange. If I added this yellow to that red where it's already on there that thick, it doesn't change the color very much. It toned it down a little bit, but not really, because this red is so much more potent than the yellow. Think of that as the value range of the red is like a 6 versus the yellow is like a 2. So you can't put a 2 value on top of a 6 and make that and change that. You have to go from lighter value to darker value if you are trying to add any, excuse me, when you're trying to mix your there we go, when you're trying to mix your colors. So what I mean by is, let's try to create an orange. Also, when you mix your oil pastels, you will notice you get colors that gets picked up on the pigment, on the crayon itself. I would suggest that you keep around, you can do it, you can use like a regular paper towel. I like to use a wet wipe because it really cleans it off very well, and just really quickly give it a wipe. Because if not, if I went to like a blue, let's say over here, and I'm trying to mix it. Okay, and I'm trying to mix a green. Right? And then I had the blue still on there, and it's gonna muddy that yellow really quickly. So to avoid getting colors muddy when you're trying to, it's not wanted, I would suggest that you clean the tips of the oil pastels periodically. Anyway, like you see me doing here, just by putting enough oil pastel down on the paper. Oh gosh. And lightly put a little bit more red, and then we're gonna move that red around and blend. You can blend colors this way. Again, moving from lighter value to darker value. Just by adding more pigment or medium on the page. After a while, the paper has soaked up enough that you can't really, you're just gonna be like moving the oil pastel around. It's so much oil pastel on the paper, but you can do a blending that way. Or, like I said, we do have this mover. You can, there's that yellow. We're gonna add a little bit of blue and a little bit more of yellow, and use the mover to move that color around. That's up to you. Oops. The mover also picks up some color, so you want to... you can do it that way. Or you can just use straight up just the crayon. That's fine. What I do not want you to use, even though I'm going to show you an example of, is let's do another orange. Q-tips. If you do Q-tips, what happens is the oil pastel gets soaked into the cotton of the Q-tip more, and it just sort of scrapes the pigment away than anything, and it starts to it picks up the pigment rather than blends anything. So unless you're trying to get rid of the oil pastel, I would not recommend you use a Q-tip. Like you already saw in that couple of seconds of rubbing this red orange, it got much lighter, like the paper started coming through, and you don't necessarily want that unless you're trying to fix the color. But so I would recommend that you just blend by layering your crayons over and over, or if you have a mover, use a mover, right? Make sure to clean the tips in between. So, there's also a thing where you can do by layering colors, and let's do a orange. No, let's do a purple. So these two are complementary colors. So if I mix these, they will become a sort of a gray. But let's say there's an area where I want yellow to show through. Oh gosh. This is what happens if you don't clean the tip of your crayon. So I have a bunch of yellow, and I want yellow to show through the gray. This requires a little bit of planning ahead in how you place your colors. But I added that purple, and it's a purpley gray. It's a chromatic gray. Chromatic grays means the gray has a tone, a light tone of color. It's not a flat, like this. is an old achromatic gray. But this is it's like a brownish, grayish. I don't know what, there's like no name to really call it. It's just a murky brown, a gray. But that's what mostly a chromatic gray is. So we've mixed all that in, and we want, like I said, if you wanted to show like areas, maybe there's like a field of, like the Gauguin landscape, there's like a field of flowers, and I want to pick some areas out and give it highlight, you can do that. And when you pick up that gray, the color that you placed ahead of time will show through. So if I wanted to do a different, let's try, this is to add a lighter value after the fact. You have to prepare the color ahead of time. So let's do this sort of tealy green color. I want it to be a little more green than that. So I'm going to mix, but not as dark as this. I didn't want it to be that bright lime. I want it to be a little more minty, but a little lighter. So we'll add that down first. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and add this orange. It makes it a bit muted. How about maybe an even darker? Okay, and same thing, if I pull away, and the amount that you pull away, you can create this sort of translucent layering also. So these are some tips to think about. All of my pastels seem to go in one direction. That's fine. You might not be able to keep that up when you're actually doing the drawing, because depending on the shape and area that you need to shade in. So moving over, I'm going to put this on this side. We'll keep these in mind. Oh, that's another thing. If you must, I hesitate to show this, but it is an option to blend. There is an option to use a little bit of clear oil. If you find yourself, like I think I asked you to get this brand specifically, but if you are struggling with sort of the consistency of the oil pastel, and you want it to blend better, right? You can use your mover, or maybe a Q-tip at this time, but dip it in a tiny bit of clear oil. It has to be clear or it will tint your colors. This could be just baby oil, whatever is around. And this sort of, like what we did with the water-soluble graphite, it starts to reconstitute the pigment and moves it around a lot more. But in order to do this even, you still have to have enough oil pastel pigment already on the page for this to work effectively. You move it around a little. But I do be careful when you're trying to do that of the amount of oil that you're loading your paper with. The paper, it won't buckle like it would do with water, but it will not take, there's a limit to the amount of wet medium that you can put on a paper. So do be mindful of that. I'm gonna pick up some of that excess. Also, if you make it just too much, and your tools will slip and slide all over the place, and it won't look like you have enough pigment on the paper, and it'll become a mess. But this is an option if you'd like. Anyway, so any questions about any of this before I move on? So the field over here, there's a lot of gold and green, and then these dark trees in there. I'm gonna work on that, and then I'll go into the sky a little bit. I won't do the whole thing on here. I want you guys to figure out some of it. But like I showed you with the scratching away, I want to put down a base of a yellow and a gold. Like this is a yellow ochre. And that seems to be about the color there. There's also sort of a in between where the yellow ochre meets the flowers and the green. There's a little bit of a purpley tint there. I'm going to go ahead and put that in, and then there's this sort of muted green, but it's probably not going to be dark enough, and we'll find these. But like I just showed you, I want to put down, especially where the blades of really light grass are and these white flowers are, an undertone of the lightest color, and then I'll come back wherever I see those wisps of white in the grass. I'm going to put down this oil pastel. Also, as I'm doing this, I should explain my demo is much smaller than what yours is going to be because I chose a landscape that is in a portrait orientation, means it's longer than it's taller than it is wider. But for yours, I would like for, if you're doing a portrait orientation like I am, turn your paper around and try to take up as much of that paper space as possible. I couldn't do that because if I turned my paper around, it wouldn't fit in the top-down camera because it records horizontally. Not really starting to make blades of grass yet. Like you do when we went over value, instead of drawing specific outlines of objects and things, what we did was we looked at the entire thing and we thought we picked up areas and shapes of value, right? You're doing the same thing except with color, but also keeping in mind that color has value now. Right? And there's a little bit of light area in there. And as I start to mix these colors, I am mindful of the way I move the crayon to keep in line with the sort of texture that I see in the painting itself, right? This part here, there's a little bit of light area in the middle there. There's a little bit of light in the top, but mostly it's a much darker value, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. There is a lot of this ochre as an undertone in this area of grass. There's also a dark patch here where there's a ochre undertone in there. There's the sides of the hills. A lot of it has an ochre under it. This building is a little warmer than the ochre. I think it's more of this sort of burnt sienna type of color. There is actually a lighter area. As I fill it in, I do want to pay attention to the edges a little bit. And yeah, we'll deal with most of that a little bit later. There's a side of the building that comes off this way. There we go. Again, we're not really putting in all the details yet. And then there's like a darker line of tree. Before I put in the dark trees, I do need to address the gray around it, but I'll leave that alone for now. I'm going to work on most of this. Let's see, there's that sort of green. There. Right. Starting to add those values. The top of the hill is a little greener. This is a little bit darker. There's still more ochre to be found. This is the part that has the darker green. So I'm going to first give it the darker green color. And in it, there's even a slight darker value there. This is more this color. It's, even though it's a green, it's like a warmer green than what's up in there. So I'm going to tone this down a little bit further. But again, I'm not really like trying to draw all of what's in this bush. I'm finding the specific sort of shape of this value. As I do so, I'm noticing the value of it needs to be addressed a little bit further. There's more ochre in there. There's this kind of green, right? It's still not like that green is still not quite a darker value, dark value enough. But what I'm gonna do is start blending those in a little bit more and then and that's about the darkest green that I have. But if it needs to be even deeper in value, that's when the shading and the tinting comes in handy. Because again, this green that I'm putting down is a little too green, and the green that I need is a little more, it's a little more muted than that. So to this green that is a little too green, remember to knock that value back. I need to add a sort of type of red. I don't want to literally add a red. I want to add a warmer reddish color. Like this will work. It's a brown, but it's got red in it. This will work. This is literally called a brown, but it's a reddish brown. Once I start layering the deeper red into the green, it desaturates that color down to the value that I need. There we go. All right. There is more yellow ochre there. There is a really dark sort of line. What I definitely want you to absolutely avoid doing, there's nice lines there like that, is add any black. Please do not use black. If you need to create a black, I'll show you an example. Use the, like we talked about, the triadic colors. Any triadic color will essentially make a black, but you can use your primary colors. You can use, like, there's a, yeah, we'll go back to the primary colors. Actually, let's try a different triadic color, like an orange and the blue. These are triadic colors, and it will get you sort of a dark grayish right? Like that and that look almost the same sort of value and hue. Like that muted green, except this is a little warmer because it's got that orange in there. Similarly, if you add like a brown, that kind of brown, and then like a blue, let's get a darker blue, right? Get that really, really dark blue. And then, is this my darkest brown? This is my darkest red brown. That's enough of a black that you do not need a black. So please, I would take this and just like throw it out. You don't need a black. Okay. The complementary colors at its like the most darkest values, the most darkest value of complementary colors at its most saturated in equal parts would give you like a dark gray to a black. So try those. Okay, if you have any questions, let me know and I can help you out with it. But do that. Again, all of these, so I picked up a purple because a lot of these undertones were, I put down a really vibrant yellow ochre. But if you looked at the painting, it's a lot more muted than that. And to mute the colors or tone those colors, you use its complementary. And the purple is the complementary of yellow. If you looked at the color wheel, it's on the opposite side of it. And so I'm going to add in where I think the colors need to be muted. Those yellows. I think it can go a little greener, so I'll put a little green in there, but mostly I'm just trying to tone down a lot of where the yellow ochre is too bright. Right, brightness. The description of a bright color is usually tied to its saturation, as well as its level of value. There's that. And now when I'm sort of layering these, I'm starting to also pay attention to the brush marks, the mark making that this particular artist is using. The trees up here all have this sort of diagonal slashed brush marks. The grass, they're generally vertical, but they also crisscross in places to make it look like it's, you know, laying down and has a direction to the leaves of the grass. There is also these parts over here where he's made these sort of horizontal, little smaller horizontal brush strokes to suggest like a brush or a shrub in that area. So read the mark making in the painting and try to mimic that as well, and not only the blobs of color. But at the beginning, you do have to just put down large areas of color, and then when you're layering to mute them and turn them into the accurate versions of the hues, that's when you're paying attention to the brush marks, the direction of the brush strokes as well. So also something to notice about this one in particular, and this like the 1 point perspective and the 2 point perspective that we've done so far will inform this information. The brush marks of these grass up here are much smaller and shorter. Okay, it's the same kind of direction, except what's on the hill goes in the direction of the hill, right? These marks. It's not purple, but I'm just showing you. But as the brush strokes describe the grass that's closer, they get longer. The width of it doesn't really change because it looks like he used one brush for all of it. But the direction, the clarity of the direction, like there's a few that go this way and that way. Again, this is the wrong color, but I'm just trying to show you the direction of the brush marks up here versus everything being this sort of ½ inch to about a 1/4 inch to about nothing little tops up top. So pay attention to those, how, again, it is a landscape drawing, so perspective will be present in all of the paintings that you choose. And if you end up with a little building like this, pay attention to the perspective that the buildings have. Like this side, I'm adding a light to the dark. This side of the house is lighter because it's turned away and it's facing the light, right? Again, I'm muting this sort of red-brown to give it a cooler color with a purple, because the purple has blue in it, right? You can literally just skip that kind of thought and go, I'm going to add a blue and make it that way, because I see a little tiny bit of blue at the top where that chimney is, and affect the color that way. Right? There's a little bit of light at the bottom there. That up top is a darker chimney. It's the same. I'm going to use a darker blue. Like I used a lighter blue up here to affect that. I'm going to use a darker blue. It might be a little too blue, so then we'll go back and add a little bit more of a redder color. Lighter red than the brown that I used, and bring that value back up a little bit. There's this one where we're going to add that blue again, or a mixture of the blues, right? This building, definitely darker, and it has this very cool, there's even like a doorway looking thing. The side of it's still very much too red. I'm going to mute it with a little bit of a purple to bring that saturation down. I'm going to add a little bit more of a blue to bring the saturation down even more. And it still needs a lot more work, but the colors are starting to match a little bit better. It needs sort of a yellowy glaze. So this is what you will be doing for this project. You're going to look at the color and try to figure out what needs to be added to make this sort of gray-brown, right? That's happening here. And it's a combination of